Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, could be articles, research notes, whatever you send, and really unpack the most important ideas to help you get informed fast.
Yep.
Today, we're diving into just one specific academic paper, but it zeroes in on a really significant and, let's be frank, pretty controversial topic.
That's right. The paper we're looking at is titled Western Youth Identity Crisis and the Baha'i Solution.
And yeah, as that title suggests, it takes a pretty strong stance.
A very strong stance.
It argues that young people in, well, Western societies are facing this huge, unprecedented identity crisis right now.
And it doesn't just say, hey, there's a crisis. It makes some, well, pretty bold claims about what it thinks is driving it. Things like gender identity, the state of traditional institutions, social media.
Right. And then, crucially, the paper proposes a specific spiritual framework, the Baha'i faith, as what it actually calls the only coherent solution.
Okay, so standard procedure for these deep dives. Our mission here is to guide you through this specific paper's arguments, its perspective. Exactly. We're here to understand what this source is saying. We're not endorsing it. We're not validating it. That's not the point.
No. And the paper definitely touches on sensitive, really hotly debated topics. But by digging into its claims, you can understand its unique viewpoint and, its key takeaways.
Absolutely. It's a paper that tries to connect a lot of different dots, different societal trends, in a way that, well, it might surprise you.
Okay, let's do it. Let's open up this source material and see what it actually argues.
So the paper kicks off by laying out what it sees as the core problem, this profound identity crisis. And it argues this isn't just some vague feeling, It says there are clear ways it shows up.
Okay, so how does the paper describe what this crisis actually looks like on the ground? What are the symptoms it points to?
Well, the source highlights things like confusion around gender, a real weakening, or you could say erosion of traditional social structures, and what it frames as a rejection of basic biological realities. It sees these as key signs of this identity crisis playing out, particularly among Western youth.
Right. And the paper digs into why it thinks this is happening, suggesting it has deep roots both in society and, well, psychologically.
Exactly. Yeah, both. On the societal side, the paper puts a lot of emphasis on the decline of traditional institutions.
Okay.
It directly links the crisis to the breakdown of family structures, citing things like, rising divorce rates, more single-parent homes.
Like the familiar trends.
Familiar trends, yeah. And alongside that, a loss of religious and cultural anchors. It points to secularization, a turning away from traditional moral absolutes, as really significant factors here.
So the paper's logic is, if those traditional structures aren't providing that sense of belonging anymore, where are young people looking instead? What does it claim?
Yeah, and the source makes a strong claim there. It basically states that without these stable anchors, like family or traditional faith, young people seek identity and belonging in what it calls online tribes, political movements, or gender ideologies.
Wow, okay. So it sees those as direct replacements for the stability that's been lost.
That's the argument it makes. It sees them filling that gap.
That's a really powerful link the paper is drawing between the decline of these older structures and the rise of new, maybe more volatile group identities. What else does it highlight as a major societal driver?
Well, another key factor for the paper is the influence of postmodernism and what it calls deconstruction.
Okay, postmodernism, how does that fit in?
It argues that the sort of widespread rejection of the idea of objective or universal truth, that feeling of your truth is valid, my truth is valid, with no shared reality.
Right, relativism.
Kind of. Combined with the rise of viewing gender as a social construct, which the paper interprets as a denial of biological sex, it argues all this leads to a lot of confusion.
Confusion even over, fundamental definitions. The paper mentions it, asking questions like, what is a woman?
Precisely. Yeah, the paper sees this very questioning of basic biological reality itself as a direct consequence of this postmodern push to deconstruct established concepts.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's social media. Big topic.
Always is. How does the paper connect social media to this specific crisis?
The source argues that algorithms on social media platforms can, and I'm quoting here, radicalize youth.
Radicalize. That's a strong word.
It is. It claims they push young people into adopting extreme identities. It points to the rapid increase in transgender identification as one example, and also what it sees as anti-family rhetoric spreading online. And it also directly links heavy social media use to isolation and mental health decline. It mentions the loneliness epidemic, rising suicide rates, things like that.
So the paper isn't just seeing social media as a platform, but as something actively shaping identities and, well, contributing to poor mental health outcomes.
That's definitely the connection the paper draws.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if we shift gears a bit to the psychological factors, the source does acknowledge that adolescence is, naturally a time for seeking and forming your identity. That's normal.
But it suggests something in the current environment makes this process go wrong somehow.
Yes. Yeah. The paper posits that without stable guidance, without a clear framework, youth are more likely to just adopt external labels, things like non-binary or transgender identities.
As kind of quick fixes.
Exactly, like quick fixes for their search for identity, rather than going through what might be a more rooted, maybe more difficult process of self-discovery.
The paper also has a specific critique of modern psychology, doesn't it? Something about therapeutic culture.
It does, yeah. It argues that contemporary psychology sometimes, maybe unintentionally, reinforces fragility.
How so?
It suggests the narrative can sometimes become, you are oppressed, therefore you must redefine yourself as the primary response to perceived victimhood. And it contrasts this directly with what the paper presents as the Baha'i view, which it characterizes as being focused on seeing challenges and tests as opportunities for resilience building, for growth.
That's a really interesting contrast the paper's drawing there. And finally, on the psychological side, it mentions something about existential nihilism.
Right. The source claims that without a sense of spiritual purpose or some kind of inherent meaning in life, youth are left with an existential void.
A void?
Yeah. And as a result, they turn to radical self-reinvention. The paper mentions gender transition again here and adopting extreme ideologies as examples of trying to find meaning in ways the paper sees as potentially destabilizing or even destructive.
So it's painting this picture where you've got societal breakdown, philosophical shifts, technology's influence, and these internal psychological vulnerabilities all mixing together.
A perfect storm, essentially.
Yeah, creating this perfect storm for an identity crisis. And to really drive its points home about this broader crisis, the paper uses the transgender movement as a specific case study, right?
Yes, exactly. It dedicates a whole section to this, analyzing it through the lens of social influence, primarily. It discusses rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD.
Okay, ROGD. Now, it's important we say ROGD is a hypothesis that's itself pretty debated within the scientific community.
Absolutely. It's controversial. But the paper cites specific studies, like one by Lisa Lippman from 2018, to support its argument about ROGD.
And what's the argument the paper makes using this concept?
The paper claims these studies, and the phenomenon described as ROGD, show how peer influence in social media are significant drivers, maybe even the main drivers in some cases, of sudden transgender identification among adolescents.
Interesting.
The paper also highlights accounts from individuals who have detransitioned, stating that they report feeling manipulated by online communities.
So the paper is really framing this rapid increase in identification, not necessarily something solely innate, but as being significantly influenced, maybe even caused, by external social and online factors. That's the paper's specific perspective here.
That is absolutely the paper's argument, yes. It also comes back to the theme of rejecting biological reality here.
How?
It interprets the current public debate around the very definition of womanhood as, and this is quite a statement, a sign of civilizational decay.
Wow.
And the source connects this directly to Baha'i writings that, according to the paper's interpretation, warn against rejecting our God-given nature.
And how does its view on feminism fit into this section?
Well, the paper argues that what it labels extreme feminism, characterized by ideas like men are obsolete, disrupts what the paper sees as a natural complementarity between the sexes.
Okay.
And contrast this with what the source says are Baha'i teachings, which emphasize harmony, not war between sexes. Again, super important to stress, this is the paper's specific interpretation of both feminism and the Baha'i teachings and how it sees them relating.
Understood. Okay, so the paper lays out its diagnosis of the crisis. It explores what it sees as the root causes, societal, psychological, technological, and it uses the transgender movement as a key illustration. So, having presented this really detailed problem, it then pivots. It turns to what it presents as the answer.
Right.
What is the solution it proposes?
This is where the paper makes its central and, like you said, very bold claim. It presents the Baha'i faith as the only coherent solution to this whole crisis.
The only coherent solution. Okay. How does it argue the Baha'i framework actually provides a way out? What are the key aspects it highlights?
Well, a major point the paper emphasizes is the Baha'i principle of the harmony of science and religion.
Harmony of science and religion. What does that mean in this context?
It states that the faith, as presented in this source, fully accepts biological reality, seeing male and female as distinct divine creations, while simultaneously advocating strongly for the dignity and equality of all individuals.
Okay, so it's trying to hold both.
Exactly. The paper argues this framework provides a kind of balance that rejects extremist ideologies. It claims it counters both traditional patriarchal oppression and what it sees as modern gender nihilism.
So the paper views this framework as offering a way to reconcile, say, scientific understanding of biology with spiritual teachings and social equality.
That's the interpretation the paper puts forward, yes.
Yeah.
It also places really significant weight on the balance between equality and what it terms complementarity.
Complementarity.
Yeah, and it uses a well-known quote from Abdul-Baha, who was a key figure in the early Baha'i faith.
What's the quote?
The quote is, "Women and men are like two wings of a bird."
Okay, a common metaphor. And how does the paper interpret that specific quote in the context of its proposed solution?
So the source interprets this quote to mean that while women and men are absolutely equal in rights and dignity, one wing isn't better than the other, they may have distinct roles that are equally valuable for the bird society to fly.
Ah, okay. Distinct but equal.
That's the idea. It presents this interpretation as a solution to feminism's excesses, claiming it aims to elevate the status of women without denying the value of men. Again, just hammering this home. This is the specific interpretation offered within this academic paper.
Got it. We heard earlier that the paper sees the breakdown of family and community as a root cause. How does its proposed solution address that piece?
Right, good point. The paper highlights the Baha'i emphasis on marriage as a sacred institution. It sees this as fundamental to preventing social fragmentation.
Okay.
And it also stresses the vital importance of parental responsibility in providing moral and spiritual education to children. It explicitly frames this as a direct counteraction to those negative influences like online radicalization that I discussed earlier.
So strengthening the family unit as a buffer.
Essentially, yes. And finally, the paper links the solution to finding purpose, specifically through service.
Service to others.
Yeah. The source claims that Baha'i youth programs are specifically designed to focus on things like character building, service to humanity, and developing critical thinking skills. And it explicitly states they avoid engaging in what it calls identity politics.
Interesting distinction.
And the paper argues that this focus on contribution, on service, actually eliminates the existential void that it identified earlier as a psychological root of the crisis.
How so?
By connecting an individual's self-worth not to external labels or ideologies, but to contributing to the betterment of civilization, finding meaning in making a positive impact.
So it's presenting this pretty comprehensive framework, isn't it? Focused on, well, seemingly traditional values in some ways, acknowledging biological reality while promoting equality, strengthening family and community, and finding purpose and contribution. All positioned as a direct antidote to the perceived chaos and meaninglessness of the identity crisis.
Precisely. That's the package it's presenting. And the paper brings all these threads together really starkly in its conclusion.
Okay, so what's the ultimate summary? How does the paper wrap things up?
Well, the source paper's main concluding argument is that the West's identity crisis isn't fundamentally about a lack of material things or progress in that sense.
Okay.
But rather it stems from what it calls spiritual bankruptcy.
Spiritual bankruptcy. And it doubles down on its claim about the Baha'i faith specifically.
Oh, yeah, it does. The paper asserts that the Baha'i faith offers exactly what's needed, a stable moral framework that stands in contrast to, postmodern fluidity,
right,
gender harmony, that avoids the extremes of both patriarchal and matriarchal ideologies,
okay,
and community resilience to counter the fragmenting and manipulative effects of digital culture that it talked about.
And the paper ends with a really pointed statement, doesn't it? Framing it almost as a choice.
It really does. The source concludes by stating its view that only divine guidance can truly heal this crisis. It declares that materialism has failed. And it presents its final thought as, basically, the choice is clear. Continue down chaos or embrace the divine remedy. leaves you right there.
Wow. Okay. So just to recap for everyone listening, we've just walked through this one specific academic paper's argument. It diagnoses a severe identity crisis among Western youth,
Right.
attributing its roots to the breakdown of traditional institutions, the influence of postmodern thought, social media, psychological vulnerabilities, using the transgender movement as a key, though controversial, case study. And then it proposes the Baha'i faith, as interpreted by the author of this paper, as a comprehensive solution, emphasizing things like the harmony of science and religion, balanced gender roles, strong family structures, and finding purpose in service.
And just to reiterate one last time, our aim here was simply to guide you through this particular source's viewpoint and the specific claims it makes within the paper itself.
Exactly. It offers a perspective, doesn't it, that connects a huge societal crisis, this identity crisis among young people, directly to what it perceives as a spiritual vacuum, and then proposes a very specific spiritual framework as the answer. It kind of makes you consider, what does that strong connection the paper draws between social problems, a perceived lack of spirituality, and a specific religious solution? What does that mean for how we think about approaching complex social issues today?
That's definitely a fascinating question to sit with as you process the paper's arguments.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.